History is a story written in blood, but it is choreographed in gold. If you look at a map of the world in 1945, you see a graveyard. From the Pyrenees to the Urals, the old world was a hollow shell. 50 million dead. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were now merely geographical coordinates for piles of rubble. In the silence that followed the final surrender in Berlin, a new, more terrifying sound began to rise, the sound of a continent's heart stopping. The history books we read in school tell a simple tale. They say that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was a response to the Red Menace. They tell us that as the Soviet Union lowered the Iron Curtain, the United States stepped forward to hold the line with tanks and planes. But that story is incomplete. It is a surface-level truth that hides a much deeper, more calculated reality. NATO was not born in a bunker. It was born in the ledger books of Wall Street and the diplomatic cables of the State Department. Before it was a military shield, it was an insurance policy. It was a massive, multinational business merger designed to save global capitalism from a death spiral. In the next several hours, we will peel back the layers of the Cold War to reveal the truth. We will explore how the American dollar became a weapon more powerful than the atomic bomb, how a famine in 1946 led to a military alliance in 1949, and why, for the architects of the New World, the military was simply the security guard for the shopping mall of the West. This is the story of why NATO was an economic alliance before it was a military one. Part 1. The Hunger Winter and the Vacuum of Power. The war was over, but the killing hadn't stopped. In 1946, a different kind of enemy was stalking the streets of Europe: starvation. The winter of 1946-1947 was the coldest in a century. Across the United Kingdom, the empire that had just won the war was running out of coal. Factories shut down. In Germany, people were living on 800 calories a day, less than half of what is needed for basic survival. This was the vacuum. General George C. Marshall, the man who had organized the American war effort, was now the Secretary of State. He looked at the maps of Europe, and he didn't see troop movements. He saw a total collapse of the human spirit. And he knew that a hungry man does not care about democracy. A hungry man cares about bread. In France and Italy, the communist parties were surging. They weren't winning because of Soviet propaganda, they were winning because they promised to feed the people. If France and Italy fell to communism through the ballot box, the United States would be isolated. But there was a more selfish fear in Washington. The American economy had become a titan during the war. To keep that titan alive, it needed someone to buy its goods. If Europe remained a graveyard, the American factories would fall silent. The Great Depression of the 1930s was still a fresh wound. To the American elite, the collapse of Europe meant the bankruptcy of America. On June 5, 1947, George Marshall stood at Harvard University and proposed a European recovery program, the Marshall Plan. He said, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." It was a brilliant piece of rhetoric. But behind the scenes, the Marshall Plan was the first brick in the wall of NATO. The US offered $13 billion, over $150 billion in today's money, to rebuild Europe. But it came with strings. To get the money, European nations had to agree to integrate their economies. They had to lower trade barriers. They had to move toward a unified market. They had to become American-style consumers. The Marshall Plan was the world's first hostile takeover, dressed as a humanitarian gift. It was the economic precursor to the military alliance. Before the US would send a single soldier back to Europe, they wanted to make sure they owned the real estate they were defending. Part 2. The dollar as a shield. By 1948, the Marshall Plan was working. Steel began to flow. The lights came back on in Paris. But a new problem emerged. If you were a businessman in New York, would you invest in a factory in West Germany if you thought the Soviet Union might invade next month? The answer was no. The Marshall Plan had created the engine, but it hadn't created the garage. European leaders like Britain's Ernest Bevin and France's Robert Schuman realized they had a leverage point. They told Washington, "You want us to be your economic partners. You want us to buy your Fords and your refrigerators. But we cannot build a future if we are terrified of the present." The Europeans demanded a security guarantee. They wanted the United States to commit to a permanent military presence. This leads us to a fundamental realization. NATO was created to provide the psychological stability necessary for the Marshall Plan to succeed. The US was hesitant. The American public was weary of foreign entanglements. But the Truman administration saw the logic. If they didn't provide a military shield, the economic investment would be lost. In April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. Article 2 of the treaty, often called the Canadian Article, specifically mentions that the parties will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between any or all of them. NATO wasn't just about Article 5, collective defense. It was about creating a safe zone for the American dollar. The dollar was tied to gold at $35 an ounce, and through NATO, the US ensured that the entire Western world would be anchored to this currency. If you wanted to be part of the security umbrella, you had to be part of the dollar system. The sword was the military, but the hand that held the sword was the treasury. Part 3. The standardization of empire. As the 1950s dawned, NATO began to transform from a piece of paper into a massive bureaucratic machine. This is where the economic alliance became visible in the most practical ways. Before NATO, every European army was a mess of different technologies. Britain used one type of rifle, France another, and the Americans a third. Their radios couldn't talk to each other. Their trucks used different parts. NATO introduced the concept of standardization. This sounds like a boring military detail, but it was a massive economic coup. By mandating that every member of the alliance use the same fuel, the same ammunition, and the same communication protocols, NATO created the largest unified market for military goods in history. And who was the primary manufacturer? The United States. American defense contractors like Lockheed, Boeing, and Raytheon didn't just win contracts, they won a permanent captive audience. By standardizing the West on American-designed equipment, the US ensured that for the next 50 years, Europe would be dependent on American supply chains. If a Dutch pilot flew a jet, that jet used American parts, American fuel, and American training. This wasn't just an alliance, it was a franchise system. Furthermore, the US used something called offshore procurement. They would use American tax dollars to buy weapons from European factories, as long as those factories followed NATO, American standards. This acted as a hidden form of industrial stimulus. It rebuilt the European defense industry, but it rebuilt it as a subsidiary of the American military-industrial complex. The military was the reason for the purchase, but the economic integration was the result. Part 4. The German Miracle and the Golden Cage. The most complex part of the NATO puzzle was Germany. How do you bring the most productive, most dangerous nation in Europe back into the fold without starting World War III? The French were terrified of a rearmed Germany. The Soviets were even more terrified. But the Americans knew that without German industry, Europe would never be a viable economic power. The solution was a stroke of genius. It was called dual integration. Germany would be allowed to rearm, but only inside NATO. Their soldiers would report to an American commander. Their logistics would be tied to a multinational system, but the economic side was even more brilliant. The European coal and steel community, the precursor to the EU, was built alongside NATO. The idea was simple. If you tie the steel and coal of Germany and France so tightly together that they cannot be separated, they cannot go to war. NATO provided the security envelope for this experiment. With the American military keeping the peace, the West German economic miracle exploded. Germany became the industrial engine of NATO. They produced the chemicals, the optics, and the engineering that the alliance needed. By the mid-1950s, the German ghost had been exorcised. The country was no longer a threat. It was a high-performance factory for the Western world. NATO had turned a former enemy into a primary shareholder in the American-led global order. Part 5. The 2% Shadow and the Modern Ledger. As we move into the 21st century, the debates about NATO have shifted. We hear about burden sharing and the 2% GDP target. But if you understand the history, these debates aren't really about tanks. They are about the cost of maintaining the global trade system. NATO is the global security guard. It ensures that the shipping lanes of the Atlantic remain open. It ensures that the undersea cables carrying trillions of dollars in digital transactions are not cut. It ensures that the rules-based international order, a system designed by the West, for the West, remains the only game in town. When a country like Poland or Estonia joins NATO, their GDP per capita typically skyrockets. Why? Because the moment they join, they are marked as safe for investment. The risk premium disappears, capital flows in, because the American military is standing at the door. NATO is the ultimate AAA credit rating. Conclusion: the merchant's peace. A raider. We began this journey by looking at the ruins of 1945. We saw a continent that was bankrupt, starving, and broken. We were told that NATO saved Europe from the Soviets. And in many ways it did. But the way it saved Europe was not just through the barrel of a gun. It was through the stability of a currency, the integration of a market, and the standardization of a civilization. NATO was and is the military wing of a global economic vision. It is the realization that peace is not just the absence of war, it is the presence of trade. The generals may plan the battles, but the bankers determine the peace. As the world changes, as the dollar faces new challenges, and as new powers rise in the East, we must remember the lesson of 1949. An alliance is only as strong as the prosperity it protects. If the economic heart of the West stops beating, no amount of tanks will be able to save the shield. The story of NATO is the story of how we traded our swords for ledgers, and how we realized that, in the modern world, they are one and the same.